The war was ending. Outside, the runways still echoed with the rumble of departing bombers, though the sky no longer needed them. Inside, beneath the vaulted steel ceiling, the last B-24 Liberator rolled toward daylight. At the far end of the mile-long line, a group of foreign officers walked in silence. Captured German engineers, men who had once inspected Messerschmitt factories and designed the Luftwaffe's precision machines, were seeing something they had not believed possible. Rows of aircraft stood wingtip to wingtip, their aluminum skin gleaming beneath the skylights. Conveyor belts carried fuselage sections past teams of women in overalls and goggles. Sparks showered from welders, and the air thudded with the rhythm of pneumatic rivet guns. To the Germans, it looked less like a factory and more like a living organism, metal flowing like blood through arteries of motion. One of them murmured to his interpreter, staring down the endless line of assembly jigs, "Kein Wunder, dass wir verloren haben." No wonder we lost. He had come expecting machinery. What he found was a civilization, a nation that had learned to build bombers the way it once built cars. In 1940, the world's skies were already burning. Europe had collapsed into flames and smoke, and Britain stood alone, its survival measured in the number of aircraft it could put into the air each dawn. Every Spitfire that rose over Kent cost precious time, material, and men to build. For the first time, victory in war depended not only on courage, but on production. Across the Atlantic, the United States was not yet in the fight, but its factories were already stirring. President Franklin Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 challenged America to arm freedom itself. Automakers, masters of efficiency, stamping presses, and speed, were summoned to transform from commerce to combat. Among them, one name stood apart: Henry Ford. The 77-year-old industrialist, who had once put America on wheels, announced he could do the same for warplanes. If the British needed bombers, he would build them the way he built Model Ts, on a moving line, piece by interchangeable piece. It sounded impossible. Aircraft were handcrafted machines, each assembled by teams of skilled mechanics in hangars. A single consolidated B-24 Liberator, America's heavy long-range bomber, required hundreds of thousands of parts and months of careful fitting. The Army Air Forces doubted Ford could mass-produce them at all, but Ford and his chief production genius, Charles E. Sorensen, believed otherwise. Sorensen had designed Ford's automotive lines at River Rouge, the most efficient factory complex on Earth, and saw no reason the same rhythm couldn't apply to aircraft. "We're going to build bombers by the mile," he told reporters. The idea was more than bravado. It was an experiment in national will. In early 1941, Ford signed an agreement with the federal government and Consolidated Aircraft to manufacture the B-24 under license. The site chosen was a quiet stretch of farmland 25 miles west of Detroit near a creek called Willow Run. There, cornfields would give way to a factory so vast that it would become a symbol of America's transformation from peace to total war. When construction began, even seasoned engineers were stunned by its ambition. The design called for 5 million square feet under one roof, a single continuous assembly line longer than any in history. The building's footprint formed the letter L. Its bend required to fit around county boundaries, and the finished plant would stretch more than a mile from first subassembly to final rollout. It was the largest factory ever built by man, and it had to be completed in months, not years. Before a single plane could be assembled, the nation itself had to retool. Machine shops from Buffalo to California converted to build jigs, dies, and fittings. Railroads laid new sidings. Thousands of workers, men, women, migrants from Appalachia, farmers from the Midwest, poured into southeastern Michigan, drawn by the promise of jobs and purpose. The logistics were staggering. Each B-24 contained over 25 million individual components. Engines came from Pratt & Whitney in Connecticut, instruments from Chicago, turrets from New York, and plexiglass from Pittsburgh. Every part had to arrive at Willow Run on schedule, in sequence, ready to fit into the moving line without pause. Ford's managers approached it like choreography. They mapped the plant's workflow as though composing a symphony, wing spars arriving precisely when fuselage sections reached Station 42. Wiring looms delivered minutes before the cockpit shell slid into place. The concept was ruthless efficiency. Motion replaced craftsmanship, and time itself became a weapon. Still, skeptics called it folly. Air Force officials worried that the tolerances required for aircraft construction, fractions of an inch, were beyond the reach of automobile assembly. A car could rattle. A bomber could not. Ford's engineers countered by designing massive adjustable jigs that held every frame and panel in alignment, allowing unskilled labor to achieve precision once reserved for master craftsmen. By December 1941, as Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the first sections of the plant were already standing, a cathedral of steel and glass rising from frozen farmland. Within months, its test runway stretched toward the horizon, and the first experimental Liberator took shape under the glow of arc lamps. America was now at war, and Willow Run was its promise made real, that the world's first true assembly line, aircraft factory could outproduce any empire that dared challenge it. What had begun as Henry Ford's boast was becoming the blueprint for modern warfare, mass production as strategy, machinery as morale. And on the other side of the ocean, German intelligence officers were beginning to notice the numbers. In the winter of 1941, the fields outside Ypsilanti froze solid. The half-finished steel frame of Willow Run stood against the Michigan snow like the skeleton of some colossal creature. Trucks labored through the mud, carrying girders, cranes, and generator parts. The air shook with hammering. Inside, the unfinished structure, engineers worked through the night by lantern light, sketching new layouts directly on the concrete floor. The problem was simple to describe, but immense to solve. No one had ever tried to build airplanes like this before. Aircraft production had always been artisanal. Mechanics hand-fitted rivets, electricians ran cables by feel, and parts were adjusted one by one. But Ford's vision demanded a rhythm, a continuous motion where parts met precision without stopping. Charles Sorensen, the man who had built the first moving automotive line at River Rouge, was determined to make it work again, this time with wings. The first task was to standardize the B-24 itself. The bomber had been designed by Consolidated Aircraft in California, where each plane was built almost like a prototype. Ford's engineers disassembled one entirely, measuring every component, and converting the blueprints into jigs that could reproduce exact copies. Each piece was numbered, labeled, and organized so that untrained workers could assemble them without improvisation. Then came the logistics of scale. The plant was a city unto itself, nearly 4 million square feet under one roof. Inside, the assembly line snaked for over a mile. Raw aluminum sheets entered one end. Completed bombers rolled out the other. To move components that large, Ford adapted his automobile conveyors, building them heavier, wider, and strong enough to carry a bomber wing the size of a train car. Above, a catwalk forest of cranes and hoists danced in careful sequence, lifting fuselage sections into place. Below, compressed air lines fed hundreds of pneumatic rivet guns, their sound a constant metallic heartbeat. The smell of oil, hot steel, and ozone filled the air. By early 1942, the workforce swelled beyond 25,000. By 1943, it was more than 40,000. Men too old for combat, women stepping into industrial jobs for the first time, farmers, mechanics, housewives, even students. They came from every state and background, sleeping in hastily built dormitories and trailer parks that surrounded the factory. The conditions were harsh, the learning curve brutal. Turnover was constant. Workers quit or collapsed from exhaustion. Management struggled to maintain discipline and morale. But each week, the line ran smoother, faster, tighter. Supervisors began calling it the bomber clock, because every hour that ticked forward meant another machine closer to flight. The first Liberator built at Willow Run rolled out in September 1942, months behind schedule, covered in fingerprints and hope. It flew, barely. Rivets loosened, seams leaked, and inspectors returned it for repairs. The newspapers mocked Ford's promise. Even the Army Air Forces whispered that Willow Run was an expensive failure. But Sorensen refused to yield. He reorganized the line, redesigning stations, swapping teams, and simplifying procedures. Instead of moving planes through one continuous line, he broke production into modules: nose, fuselage, tail, and wings, each built separately and joined at the end. It was the birth of modular assembly, a method that would later define every factory on Earth. By early 1943, the rhythm had found its pulse. The plant produced one bomber a day, then two. By the end of the year, the line moved so efficiently that inspectors timed it with stopwatches. A complete B-24 Liberator, each weighing 18 tons and containing 450,000 parts, now left the factory every 63 minutes. To outsiders, it looked like sorcery. To those inside, it was discipline. Every worker performed a single motion, perfected and repeated thousands of times. They called themselves Ford's Flying Line. The results were staggering. By 1944, Willow Run alone produced 8,685 B-24s, more aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe had in service that year. German reconnaissance photos taken over the United States in late 1943 showed the plant's immense shape, its mile-long roof glinting under the snow. Analysts in Berlin marked it on their maps, labeling it Flugzeugfabrik, Detroit Sector. But no one in Germany could quite believe the numbers Allied intelligence reported. Inside the Reich Ministry of Armaments, a staff officer studying captured production data scribbled a note in the margin. "If this is accurate, the war is already lost." He was right, for in the cold symmetry of Willow Run's line, steel, speed, repetition, the United States had created something new, an army that did not sleep, a weapon that built itself through human hands. And while soldiers fought across oceans, America's victory was being riveted together one bomber, one shift, one heartbeat at a time. Every war builds its own army. At Willow Run, that army did not wear uniforms. It wore overalls. By 1943, more than 40,000 workers passed through the factory gates each day. The parking lots stretched for miles, filled with the Fords and Chevrolets that their owners had once built for peacetime roads. The air around the plant never slept. The clatter of trains bringing aluminum and engines, the constant hum of compressors, the rising whistle that marked each new shift. Inside, under the glow of fluorescent lamps, the factory pulsed like a living body. Women in kerchiefs stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had once plowed fields or fixed radios. Lines of welders hunched over wings that stretched longer than a house. The rhythm was relentless. A rivet every few seconds, a glance to the foreman, a new part rolling down the line. They called it the City of Aluminum. Many of the workers had never seen an airplane before they helped build one. Training was brief, sometimes just hours. A woman from Ohio might learn to install cockpit wiring before lunch and spend the rest of the war doing nothing else. A farmer from Kentucky might fit oxygen hoses into the nose section, day after day, until his fingers memorized the movement. The repetition was hypnotic, and the scale was staggering. The line stretched more than a mile. At the east end, raw metal entered by train. At the west end, finished bombers roared to life, taxiing out into sunlight. Between those 2 points lay thousands of stations, each a small world of noise, heat, and focus. The noise was ceaseless. Rivet guns barked like machine fire. Cranes groaned overhead. Forklifts squealed past barrels of lubricants and boxes of plexiglass. When someone dropped a wrench, it vanished into the clamor. People learned to shout with their eyes. Fatigue became a way of life. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts overlapped. There were no weekends, only rotations. Cafeterias served meals around the clock. Some workers carried sandwiches in their pockets to eat while the line moved. Managers called it continuous flow, but to those on the floor it felt like time itself had joined the production schedule. Yet pride grew with exhaustion. Each man and woman knew that every bolt, every rivet, carried meaning beyond the walls of Michigan. They read the newspapers, stories of bombers over Europe, of paratroopers carried in planes their hands had built. The war was distant, but its echoes reached them through the factory speakers that played Roosevelt's speeches over the din. Women especially changed the face of Willow Run. By 1944, nearly one-third of the workforce was female. They wore blue denim and red bandanas, their hands scarred by rivet burns. The press called them Rosies. Some came from Detroit, others from distant farms. For many, it was their first taste of independence, of paychecks signed in their own names. They built engines, installed wiring harnesses, even tested hydraulic systems. When someone asked a forewoman what her job was, she smiled. "I make bombers fly." It wasn't easy. Winters were brutal. Summers suffocating. The vast glass roof turned the plant into an oven. Ventilation was poor, and the roar of machines drowned out every conversation. But camaraderie grew in the shared fatigue. In coffee lines at midnight, in laughter over spilled rivets, in songs hummed between hammer strikes. Willow Run became a community. Nearby, hastily built neighborhoods filled with trailers and prefabricated houses sprouted across the countryside. Schools, shops, and clinics followed. People married, raised children, and measured time not in months, but in bombers produced. Each new milestone was celebrated like a victory. The 1,000th B-24, the 5,000th, then the unimaginable 8,000th. The plant that critics had once called a failure was now the largest producer of bombers in history, and word of it spread far beyond America. Allied officers visiting the plant walked its catwalks in silence, awed by its scale. Soviet envoys compared it to a weapon of pure organization. British observers simply called it impossible. In that impossible place, the ordinary had become extraordinary. Mechanics, mothers, migrants, together they built a force so vast that it bent the course of the war. Some said Willow Run had no heroes. But every shift, thousands of hands reached out and touched the same aluminum skin, believing that somewhere across the ocean it would help bring someone home. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was a machine that built machines. Every inch of it had been designed to move, to carry, lift, join, and align, with almost no human hesitation. Engineers called it the mechanical river. Aluminum flowed in at one end. Aircraft rolled out the other. In between was the genius of industrial choreography. The heart of that choreography was Charles E. Sorensen, known among Ford men as Cast Iron Charlie. A master of efficiency, Sorensen had spent years perfecting motion, not flight but movement itself. He believed that victory belonged to whoever could eliminate waste. At Willow Run, he turned that philosophy into geometry. The building's L-shaped layout wasn't an accident. Its long east-west arm handled the early subassemblies, wing spars, tail sections, and cockpit frames. The shorter north-south leg housed the final assembly line and runway. Parts began as flat sheets of aluminum at one end. They were cut, riveted, wired, and then joined in stages that mirrored the logic of Ford's car lines. Sorensen's secret weapon was the jig, a steel framework that locked each component into precise position. Instead of skilled fitters aligning parts by eye, untrained workers could now bolt panels into jigs and achieve near-perfect tolerance. The bomber's complex curves were broken down into measurable, repeatable steps. The factory was divided into sub-assembly zones, each specializing in one module of the B-24, nose, midsection, wings, tail, and control surfaces. These modules traveled along conveyor belts, carried by cranes and dollies that glided through overhead tracks. At the line's midpoint, the sections came together. Wings mated to fuselage, engines installed, glass fitted. The process transformed chaos into order. Where early production had required months per aircraft, Willow Run could now produce a bomber from raw stock to rollout in less than 28 hours. Even the factory's utilities reflected its purpose. Beneath the floor, tunnels carried compressed air, fuel, and electricity to every station. Overhead, catwalks allowed supervisors to oversee the entire line at once. Lights glowed day and night, erasing the distinction between shifts. At its peak, Willow Run consumed as much power as the entire city of Ann Arbor. Coordination reached far beyond Michigan. Over 900 subcontractors across the United States supplied parts to the line. Pratt & Whitney shipped engines from Connecticut. Sperry sent gyroscopic bomb sights from New York. And hundreds of small shops built everything from seat frames to navigation lights. Railroad sidings brought shipments directly into the plant, timed to the minute. To manage it all, Ford introduced a centralized scheduling system, what we would now call logistics computing. Clerks with slide rules and punched cards mapped every movement of material and manpower. Each part had a code, each process a clock. If a shipment was delayed by even an hour, the schedule rippled through the plant like a wave. To control that chaos, Sorensen built an office of planners who monitored the factory's pulse in real time. It was a primitive but effective version of a digital network, the blueprint for modern manufacturing coordination. To test each finished bomber, Ford built its own airfield directly beside the plant. The runway, over a mile long, allowed new B-24s to taxi straight from the final assembly point into flight testing. The first time, a pilot took off from Willow Run's runway and circled back to see the entire complex stretching below. Half a mile wide, a mile long, he radioed the tower. "It looks like another city down there." And in a way, it was. A city designed not for living, but for producing life for others. The Liberator itself became a symbol of that vision, an aircraft born from the mathematics of motion. Its 4 engines, twin bomb bays, and tricycle landing gear made it versatile and durable. But its true power came from the fact that it could be built faster than any other heavy bomber on Earth. By 1944, Willow Run's efficiency outpaced imagination. At full strength, it produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. On one record-setting day, 25 bombers rolled out in 24 hours. No other nation, not even Germany at its industrial height, had anything comparable. German aircraft plants were dispersed, manual, and vulnerable to bombing. Their craftsmen were skilled, but slow. Their production depended on precision, not volume. When captured German engineers toured Willow Run after the war, they understood what had destroyed them. Not a single weapon, but a system. An industrial organism whose heartbeat was synchronization. They had built airplanes. America had built processes. And that difference, invisible on the battlefield but absolute in its consequences, was the moment modern warfare changed forever. By early 1944, the factory that once struggled to finish a single aircraft now moved like clockwork. The morning whistle no longer called workers. It summoned motion. Forklifts glided across polished floors. Cranes swung precisely timed arcs, and the long silver spine of the assembly line pulsed under an ocean of fluorescent light. Every 63 minutes, a new B-24 rolled out toward daylight. The transformation was total. Where chaos had once reigned, misplaced rivets, wrong bolts, delayed shipments, now there was choreography. Each workstation was a measure in a symphony of precision. 276 stations from the first jig to the final inspection, each synchronized to the minute. At the west end of the plant, the runway glittered with aluminum. Completed bombers stood wingtip to wingtip, engines coughing to life, their propellers blurring into wind. Pilots tested brakes, throttles, and radios. When a line of them lifted off together, the noise was like thunder rolling across the Michigan fields. The sound of an assembly line turned into flight. Every aircraft bore a number, one among thousands, yet each destined for a name. Witchcraft, Strawberry Bitch, Buzzin' Cousin. Their crews would never see the people who built them, and the builders would never see where their bombers flew. But both sides of that connection believed in the same thing: production as power. For the United States, Willow Run became more than a factory. It was a symbol. Newspapers called it the Grand Canyon of industry. Photographers captured its endless lines of fuselages and women at work, their faces streaked with aluminum dust. Visitors, generals, congressmen, foreign dignitaries, stood at the catwalk railings and stared silently down the mile-long river of machinery. In Washington, the War Production Board tracked Willow Run's numbers with quiet astonishment. In January 1944 alone, the plant produced 650 bombers. By spring, the total crossed 7,000, a figure so large that even the Army Air Forces struggled to absorb them. At one point, B-24s left Willow Run faster than training crews could be assigned to fly them. Each bomber required 65,000 separate drawings, 313,000 rivets, and over 1,000 miles of electrical wire, and yet the plant treated those figures like clockwork. By mid-1944, its efficiency reached beyond comprehension. In the time it took a German factory to finish a single Messerschmitt, Willow Run had completed an entire squadron. Across the ocean, German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the complex from high altitude. The pictures reached the Luftwaffe's intelligence section in Berlin, where analysts puzzled over its scale. They had never seen anything like it. A building that appeared to have its own runway, its own rail system, its own power grid. Reports described a production hall over 1 mile in length. At first, they dismissed the numbers as American propaganda. But by mid-1944, captured data from downed U.S. bombers confirmed the serial ranges. The realization struck like a physical blow. A single factory in Michigan had built more four-engine bombers than all of Germany combined. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, later admitted in his memoirs that the news from Willow Run left him deeply shaken. The German industrial system, efficient, disciplined, centralized, had been outdone not by genius, but by scale. In a private meeting, Speer told Hitler that the United States had industrialized war itself. The Führer refused to believe it. He demanded verification. Speer sent analysts to compile Allied production statistics from radio intercepts and captured documents. The results were irrefutable. In 1 month, Willow Run alone produced as many heavy bombers as the entire German aircraft industry could build of all types combined. For the Luftwaffe, that fact was catastrophic. Every bombing raid that tore through the skies of Europe, every daylight formation of hundreds of B-24s and B-17s stretching, horizon to horizon, was the visible consequence of that line in Michigan. German pilots who survived missions over England, or Italy would look up at the endless streams of bombers and ask where they came from. The answer seemed mythic, from factories that never stop, and somewhere between disbelief and despair, the myth became reality. By summer 1944, even the most loyal officers in the Reich Air Ministry knew what Willow Run meant. It was proof that America's strength was not in any single weapon, but in the power to reproduce it endlessly. The war had become arithmetic, and Germany's numbers could no longer add up. From the quiet of the Midwest to the skies above Berlin, the rhythm of Willow Run echoed, 63 minutes per plane, hour after hour, day after day, until quantity itself became a form of victory. Berlin, summer 1944. In a dimly lit room inside the Reich Ministry of Armaments, a small group of analysts gathered around a stack of photographs. They were aerial images, intercepted intelligence, and reports from neutral observers. Across one of them stretched a single structure, mile-long, white-roofed, with a runway emerging from its western edge. The caption read, "Willow Run, Michigan, Consolidated B-24 Production Facility." At the head of the table, Albert Speer studied the data silently. On the map beside him, pins marked every aircraft plant still standing in the Reich: Dornier in Friedrichshafen, Junkers at Dessau, Messerschmitt at Regensburg. Each was surrounded by notes: bomb damage, labor shortages, fuel rationing. He read the figures again: 8,685 liberators in 1944 from one plant. He leaned back, exhausted. It was the number, not the picture, that broke him. In the air war, the Luftwaffe still fought bravely, but its strength was a shadow of what it once was. Each lost aircraft cost months to replace. The Allied losses, though enormous, were absorbed without pause. Speer understood now why. America's factories did not merely build planes, they replaced them faster than war could destroy them. He turned to his aides and said what none dared admit aloud: "They are producing faster than we can even repair." For years, German propaganda had boasted of technological superiority: faster fighters, better tanks, advanced rockets. But none of it mattered. The Reich had built machines. The United States had built systems. The Luftwaffe's intelligence division confirmed the scale through recovered bomber serials. The sequence numbers stamped on each downed B-24 showed consistent growth, thousands apart, increasing every month. It was arithmetic proof of industrial power. The realization spread through the upper ranks like shock. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, once head of aircraft procurement, was blunt in a private meeting. The Americans are not building airplanes. They are building factories that build airplanes. In that sentence lay the difference between eras. At Willow Run, production was impersonal, relentless, infinite. Shift changes didn't slow the line. Snowstorms didn't stop it. Its engines of manufacture outlasted men themselves. Germany, by contrast, still depended on craftsmanship, on small workshops, master fitters, and dispersed facilities that could be bombed out of existence. Even the Nazi effort to match this scale, Speer's Total War Industrial Program, arrived too late. Raw materials were vanishing. Skilled labor had been conscripted. Allied bombing shredded supply lines faster than they could be rebuilt. Meanwhile, in Michigan, workers paused only to celebrate milestones: the 5,000th B-24, the 8,000th, the record of one bomber every 63 minutes. President Roosevelt called it the miracle of production. The Germans called it the death factory. By autumn 1944, reconnaissance photos showed hundreds of liberators parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields in England and Italy, more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could put into the air across all of Europe. Each had been born from the same place, Willow Run's endless line. The psychological impact reached beyond numbers. German pilots flying defense missions over the Reich began reporting waves of bombers that seemed to regenerate overnight. Shoot down 20 today, and 30 appeared tomorrow. It is as if their factories are bottomless, one squadron commander wrote in his diary before his death. He wasn't wrong. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, bombers, fighters, transports, more than Germany and Japan combined. But it was Willow Run that symbolized the heart of it. One plant, one rhythm, one unstoppable machine. Speer visited the ruins of the Junkers plant at Bernburg that winter and said quietly to an aide, "We will never build like them. They build like nature, continuous, tireless." That understanding, more than any battle, marked the true turning point of the air war. From that moment on, German strategy became reactive, dispersing factories underground, decentralizing production, hiding machines instead of multiplying them. But dispersion slowed efficiency. What Willow Run had taught the world was simple. Centralization, synchronization, and speed could win a global. In early 1945, when Allied forces captured surviving German industrial officials, their interrogations revealed a consistent theme. Every one of them mentioned Willow Run by name. They had studied it through photographs, diagrams, and intercepted data. They had tried to replicate its efficiency and failed. One engineer told his interrogator, "At first we thought it was a bluff. Then we realized the Americans had turned their entire country into a Willow Run. He wasn't exaggerating. By the time the Red Army entered Berlin, the Luftwaffe was a memory. Its pilots outnumbered 10-1, its factories shattered. Meanwhile, in Michigan, the final B-24 rolled off the line. Workers cheered, unaware that across the ocean, the men who once believed in German efficiency now stood in silence, staring at photographs of a factory that had changed the world. Willow Run never dropped a bomb. It didn't have to. Its weapon was abundance. By 1944, the sky itself had changed color. What had once belonged to the Luftwaffe was now filled with the glint of aluminum. Formation after formation of B-24 Liberators and B-17 flying fortresses stretching from horizon to horizon. To soldiers on the ground, they looked endless. To those who built them, they were the rhythm of Willow Run made visible. The effect was nothing short of strategic annihilation. Willow Run's bombers joined fleets from Douglas, North American, and Boeing to form the 8th and 15th Air Forces, a hammer that struck day after day. The B-24, with its long range and heavy payload, became the workhorse of that sky-borne offensive. They carried bombs to the oil fields of Ploiești, to the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, and to the marshalling yards that fed the German front. Each raid cost lives, each mission burned engines and crews, but the aircraft never stopped coming. Behind every wave stood a factory in Michigan that could rebuild an entire air armada faster than it could be shot down. The numbers told their own story. In 1944, Allied production delivered more than 11,000 B-24s, nearly three-quarters of them from Willow Run. German fighter output the same year barely reached a fraction of that. Even as Me-262 jets appeared, they arrived too few, too late, and without fuel to fly. Pilots who bombed Germany often spoke of an eerie feeling, a sense that they were extensions of something larger, part of a machine that stretched all the way home. One recalled flying over Berlin in a formation so vast that, when the first bombs fell, the last planes had not yet crossed the coast of France. Back in Michigan, the line never paused. The factory worked through Christmas, through blackouts and shortages, through blizzards that froze the runways. Workers pinned letters to the fuselages, prayers, names, bits of humor, from Rosie to Rommel, built by Joe from Detroit. For them, every aircraft that left the hangar was both a weapon and a promise. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, Willow Run had already outpaced its own purpose. Its stockpiles filled faster than the war could consume them. Liberators now lined American airfields, engines capped, wings shimmering in the sun. Production began to taper. The war's end was in sight. When Germany finally surrendered that May, the numbers stood frozen in history. 8,685 Liberators built at Willow Run, roughly one every hour during its peak months. It had produced more aircraft than all the Axis powers combined could match in heavy bombers throughout the war. The plant that had once defined urgency now stood almost silent. Workers celebrated with parades and tears. Some stayed to help decommission the line. Others drifted to new jobs or back to the farms they had left behind. The war had ended, but it had changed them. They had learned that industry could feel like destiny, that the noise of rivet guns and the glow of welders could be as decisive as any battlefield. Ford management, unsure what to do with a mile-long factory built for war, briefly considered turning Willow Run into an automobile plant. But post-war demand shifted, and the government soon repurposed it for new contracts. First for cargo aircraft, later for jet bombers under the Cold War's expanding shadow. The plant's identity evolved, but its spirit remained: relentless motion, endless ambition. In later decades, it would build the C-119 flying boxcar and then, under General Motors, parts for automobiles once again. Yet, among those who had seen it at its height, Willow Run would always be remembered not for what it produced, but for what it represented. It proved that democracy could outbuild dictatorship, that freedom, when organized and determined, could become as disciplined as tyranny. When German engineers examined the plant after the war, they did not speak of ideology or machines. They spoke of scale, of a society that had turned abundance into strategy. One of them wrote in his report, "We believed the factory was a place. In America, it is a power." And that power had written the outcome of the war in rivets, steel, and speed. When peace came, Willow Run did not sleep. It simply changed its dreams. The war had proven what Ford's engineers had always believed, that industry could be orchestrated like music. But in 1945, the orchestra stopped mid-note. The line that had once produced a bomber every hour now stood motionless, its catwalks echoing with the sound of wind instead of rivet guns. For a while, the hangars became storage. Rows of unused B-24s sat in the fields, gleaming like silver tombstones of victory. Then, as new conflicts stirred, the factory's heartbeat returned. The government leased sections of Willow Run for post-war aircraft production, C-1-19, flying boxcars, F-86 Sabre jet components, and later parts for the B-47 Stratojet. The Cold War gave the factory a new identity. Its vast spaces, once built for bombers, now served as test beds for America's emerging aerospace age. Engineers who had cut their teeth on piston engines learned to build turbines and jets. The lessons of Ford's line, modular assembly, precision logistics, synchronized labor, became blueprints for every aerospace plant that followed. What had begun as an emergency wartime experiment had quietly invented the DNA of modern manufacturing. By the 1950s, Willow Run had become more than a name. It was a model. Companies across the world studied its methods. Toyota in Japan, de Havilland in Britain, even Soviet industrial planners who had once feared its output. Each sought to understand how one factory had transformed the meaning of production. Meanwhile, the plant's story turned into legend. For Americans, it was proof that democracy could mobilize with the precision of an empire. For workers, it was a memory of purpose, a time when every hand turned bolts for something larger than itself. But the years that followed brought decline. Automation rose. Car manufacturing moved elsewhere. By the 1970s, parts of Willow Run stood abandoned, its once bright steel trusses streaked with rust. The post-war boom had shifted to smaller, cleaner facilities. Still, echoes of the past lingered. Veterans of the factory remembered how it had felt. The smell of oil and ozone, the thundering rhythm of production, the moment when a bomber first rolled into the sunlight. It was like building victory itself, one recalled. Historians later called Willow Run the birthplace of the American industrial miracle. It was not simply an engineering success, but a social one. It united men and women, farmers and city dwellers, skilled craftsmen and first-time workers into a single purpose. It showed that collective effort, not ideology, could forge a civilization strong enough to defeat tyranny, and it foreshadowed something larger: the modern world's uneasy marriage between automation and humanity. In Willow Run's endless line, you can see the origins of today's assembly robots, logistics algorithms, and global supply chains. It was both the triumph of human coordination and the beginning of its replacement. In the decades that followed, as the jet age gave way to the digital one, Willow Run's vast hangars hosted new tenants, research labs, storage facilities, even car plants under General Motors. But the myth never died. Historians, veterans, and engineers kept returning to its story, the mile-long line that proved freedom could outbuild fear. By the time the plant finally closed in 2010, its roof sagged under decades of snow, its glass panes clouded with dust. Yet, when the demolition crews arrived, they found something remarkable: the floor still perfectly level, the rails of the old assembly line still visible, as if waiting for the next generation of builders to return. Part of the site remains preserved today, transformed into a museum and memorial. Visitors walk where the line once moved, tracing the path of aluminum and ambition from the first jig to the runway. In the quiet, it's hard to imagine the roar that once filled this space, the sound of 40,000 people working in rhythm, believing they were building more than machines. They were building endurance. They were building proof that a free people, when united by purpose, could make the impossible ordinary. And in that proof lies Willow Run's true legacy. It was not just the factory that won a war. It was the moment humanity learned that the assembly line, a creation of peace, could also become the most powerful weapon ever devised. In war, factories rarely earn the glory that battlefields do. They have no medals, no heroes, no graves, only echoes. Yet it is in those echoes that victory often hides. Willow Run was never meant to be beautiful. It was functional, relentless, efficient. But in its relentless rhythm, it revealed something profound about human nature. When faced with annihilation, people did not only fight, they built. They turned sweat into steel and routine into resistance. What the Germans saw when they toured Willow Run after the war was not just industrial might. It was a civilization learning how to think in motion. Machines had not replaced humanity there. They had extended it. The assembly line became a mirror of the human pulse. Repetitive, yes, but filled with intent. Every rivet, every weld, every completed bomber was an act of will, proof that democracy could organize itself with the precision of an empire, yet without its chains. And when the war ended, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was awe. The workers left, the lights dimmed, the conveyors cooled. But the idea did not fade. From Willow Run's mile-long heartbeat grew the systems that now define the modern world. Logistics, automation, continuous production. Today, when we watch assembly lines build cars, computers, or rockets, we are hearing the same rhythm that once rolled bombers into the sunlight of 1944. We are living inside the inheritance of that factory, a world where speed and scale can decide the fate of nations. Yet the lesson of Willow Run is not one of machines. It is one of unity. It reminds us that power, when guided by purpose, can protect rather than destroy. It shows that even in the darkest years of war, humanity's greatest weapon was not hatred or technology, but coordination, faith, and the quiet hands that built hope by the hour. The last B-24 to leave Willow Run lifted slowly into a blue Michigan sky, its shadow gliding over the endless roof that had birthed it. Below, the workers watched in silence, tired, proud, unaware that history would remember them not for their names, but for their rhythm. A rhythm that began as noise and ended as the sound of victory.